Good morning. Well, morning for me. Don't know what time it is for you. Welcome to week 2 of SFL 465. This week we are going to be talking about diversity in the family systems that we get to learn about and conceptualize and perceive what's going on. We'll also be talking about self of the therapist issues in the next lecture. So I don't think there's any particular announcements. Hopefully we got to have a lab last Friday and we'll have a lab again this Friday. That is an opportunity, of course, for you to ask questions. Maybe as you are watching these videos, if a question comes up or something you want to be clear about or get more clarification on, write it down and then bring it to the lab so we can go over things. So I'm going to share my screen and here we go. Families and context. So there will be a number of contexts that we talk about today. And of course, there are more contexts than this, but this is what we'll cover: gender, ethnicity, culture, spirituality, and sexuality, and how those elements of the context impact the family dynamics that we see. So, of course, context has powerful influences on family relationships. Understanding those contexts is key to conceptualizing family dynamics. So as we look at families throughout this semester, and as we focus particularly on the Lee family from the book, Everything I Never Told You, we will be looking at some of these issues. As you also do work this semester in assessing families, some of these issues will come up. Maybe not all of them, but one or two at least I would expect to come up. And if you are not noticing any of these contexts in the families that you are assessing or thinking about or conceptualizing, then pause and take a minute and see maybe why you're not noticing anything and what there is to notice. We'll talk a little bit more later in the lecture about why you might not be noticing some of these things. Okay, so last week when we talked about systems theory, I shared about Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, which you have likely already been exposed to. I want to touch on it again just briefly because this is a way to understand how all these contexts impact families, the mechanisms for their influence. So as we talked about before, in the middle, that individual we have, and the family microsystem and mesosystem, there are things that come from the macrosystem and from the exosystem that get inserted into the family culture. And those can be both what exists already in the family culture because of generational, so we're looking at chronosystem influences and how people perceive normal to look, what, for example, homeostasis looks like, what kind of interactions family members have, what roles and rules are there in the family. It can also be influences that come in. Maybe it's a new context, maybe the family has moved and the culture is slightly different, or maybe they immigrate from a different country, or maybe there are things that over time the family feels more, maybe as children grow up or as jobs change, things like that. So exosystem and macrosystem influences do position the family in some of their experiences and patterns. In the textbook, it talks a little bit about how this is an umbrella. So last week we talked about systems theory being foundational for all of these models. Understanding the contextual elements you could perceive as an umbrella. It's going to impact everything that we are looking at conceptually, it might not be specifically part of the models that we are talking about, but in the midst of those models, these influences will be there. So don't forget about them. And let's see here. Okay, so I mentioned how roles, rules, also power dynamics can all be influenced by some of these contextual elements. So I'm going to go over some of those a little bit more specifically. And as I do that, I want to clarify that I myself am part of these systems and have only my own limited experience. Maybe you have more experiences with some of these. Maybe you have things you want to share to help the class or learning system contextualize and be able to understand better what families might be experiencing. So please share those both in digital dialogues, also in the labs. As I talk about these things, I just want to clarify that I am not an expert in these areas. I've had, of course, some experiences here, but there are many who've had many different experiences. So I will do my best to share what I understand, but you getting to inform yourself about other cultural elements will be important and great for this class. Okay, gender. Gender is something that is kind of part of how we understand people, how we understand roles and rules, and yet we don't often think about how gender impacts us. And as there's more, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the course also maybe, but as there are shifts in our understandings of gender, as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals are recognized more in our society. And also before that, as the feminist movement happened, there have begun to be more examinations of gender and more understandings about how gender and our theories about gender and our expectations for gender may not best fit the people who live that experience. However, in most families, there are issues of gender. So, in terms of roles and expectations, if you have a traditional family, particularly, and in Utah Valley, we do have a lot of traditional families, having roles be specialized in terms of gender is a pretty typical thing. So maybe the husband expects to be the breadwinner. Maybe he expects to be emotionally stable. Maybe he expects to fix things, both around the house and emotionally. Maybe the man expects to have kind of the final say on things. And then maybe the woman expects to be the nurturer, the stay-at-home mom, the caretaker. Those gender expectations are shifting, certainly in our society, and yet there's still lots of traditional. And even as they shift, that can be a difficult shift for families. So that can be difficult both as maybe the wife now has a job, and so they're having to rejuggle who is taking care of children and who is doing the housework. And when both families have come from traditional scenarios, that can be a difficult adjustment. It can be difficult for them to figure out how to make the changes so that everything gets done and people don't feel overwhelmed. Also, that can happen over the course of a family's kind of trajectory. Maybe there's more specialization when the kids are quite young. So perhaps mom is going to be a stay-at-home mom, or maybe dad is going to be a stay-at-home dad. But young kids often require a lot of time and physical attention. Now, maybe the kids are going to daycare, and so it's not that big of a shift. But over, again, we're talking chronosystem now, over the course of the family's development, maybe those gender roles and expectations shift. So where mom needed to be at home, or a parent needed to be at home while the children were quite small, once all the children are in school or in high school, maybe that parent doesn't have as much to do, and so there are going to be some changes in those roles and expectations that are based on gender. Maybe now mom is going to get a job or go back to school. That's what happened in my family. Raised kids for 15 years and then went back to school. So again, recognizing what's going on in terms of roles and expectations in gender, and how gender impacts those as you're conceptualizing a family is important. Then rules. Rules can kind of go along with the expectations, but it can also be what is appropriate. What is appropriate for a boy? What is appropriate for a man? What's appropriate for a girl? What's appropriate for a woman? If you have a son in the family, is he going to get more attention in terms of technical training? Is that kind of a rule that the boy is going to get a job as a teenager, but maybe the daughter doesn't have to? Or is it a rule that when kids are struggling emotionally, they go to mom? Now, these might not be explicit rules, they might be implicit. But recognizing how gender impacts those rules is going to be important. And then, of course, power dynamics. Who has the power? But of course, there's lots of power in the family, and it can be different in different areas. So perhaps in the husband's sphere, he has the power. Maybe he gets to say when he works and when he comes home, and that's kind of his sphere. Maybe the wife at home becomes kind of a gatekeeper, and she wants things to be done a certain way. And so husband comes into that sphere, and maybe he wants to interact with the kids or do things his way or parent his way. And mom is like, nope, that's not how we do it. And then she might be critical of him or exert her power in some way to say, this is my sphere and I'm kind of protective of it. So power is not a unidimensional concept in the family. Power can have lots of different areas. You might also look at power in terms of sexuality. We'll talk about sexuality kind of in a different way later. But in terms of sexual relationships between a husband and wife, maybe the husband is kind of a typical man and has more sexual interest and the wife has less. Whoever has less interest typically has more power. So that might be another aspect to consider in that power dynamic, and how gender and gender roles and expectations impact that area of the family. Next, ethnicity. So this is a big one. We have had a lot of discussion about race this, 2020, last summer. And I think more and more it's coming into the kind of accepted public sphere of how is race impacting people's experience, both in their own families and in society. And both of those things are important to consider. So in their own family, maybe ethnicity has certain, because of that ethnicity, there are certain cultural constructs that are accepted and that are lived out in the family. Now, maybe, and I'm just going to be really general here, recognizing that each family is different and has its own culture also. But perhaps in some ethnicities or races, there are roles and rules for what happens in the family that involve a lot of closeness, for example. It's maybe normal to depend particularly on family and not to have as strong relationships outside of the family. Or maybe we get back into gender and ethnicity impacts gender roles by saying what is acceptable and what is normal uh, for a man and for a woman. Ethnicity may also impact the family, as we see in the Lee family in that Everything I Never Told You book, um, by having the society see that family's ethnicity as a reason to have assumptions about them, as a way that they are different. Um, Under roles and expectations, there it says, are there social roles my ethnicity is expected to have? So historically, this has changed, hopefully, and hopefully we're getting closer and closer to just seeing that although ethnicity may impact people and can be a valuable and rich part of their identity, we don't need to assume what it means about somebody. There was a long time in the history of the US that Asians were allowed into the country only when they showed aptitude in science and math. And so sometimes we have the perception that Asians are really good at math and science. Now, that's completely an assumption and a stereotype, but because of the historical happenings where that's who was let in, it kind of makes sense that that may be a perception that we get. But again, we need to check those perceptions. Um, we have had governmental leaders characterize and be derogatory towards ethnicities, call them violent and criminals and rapists and things like that. So obviously that's going to impact people who identify as that ethnicity and how they feel in society. And then that also impacts the family. We're thinking about that ecological systems model where what's happening in the mesosystem and what's happening in kind of outer layers impacts what happens inside. So maybe there's a man who is Mexican who's looking for work and gets passed by. People don't want to hire him, or maybe he gets a job, but it's well below his capacity, and his boss treats him very poorly and stiffs him pay. And that's going to impact what he brings then back into the family, how he sees himself, and the family dynamics around that. Are there social rules about my ethnicity? So um, different ethnicities or cultures, and all of these are actually elements of culture. How we perceive gender, how we perceive sexuality, religion, economic things, all of those are part of culture. But are there social rules about my ethnicity? So until the 60s, there were social rules about how um, African Americans and people of color could interact with others. There were social rules about where they could be and what facilities they could use and what jobs they could hold. And again, thankfully, that's changing. But there are still ways that that long period of our history has continued through the chronosphere. So now, or the chronosystem, so that now how we perceive people of color, and maybe not us personally, but how people of color are perceived by some people in our culture, um, continues to be impacted. And maybe there are rules that some people perceive, and in terms of how they treat people of color. And so being aware of, if maybe a family comes in and maybe they're all people of color, or maybe they've adopted a child that is African American, or whatever it is, they are going to be feeling the impacts of society. And maybe they say, I notice these microaggressions, and being able to listen and assume that that person is the expert in their life and in their experience is a really important part of conceptualizing, because until you accept what their experience is, you're not going to understand how it's really impacting them. Power, we kind of talked about that through this. Some of the rules and how people are allowed to be impacts their sense of power or powerlessness in the society. When there is a long history of powerlessness, sometimes people, get triggered and want to assert some level of power. So that can show up in lots of ways. And if they feel powerless in a larger society, maybe they want to feel more powerful in their family. So being able to conceptualize, again, this is it's a system, and so being able to conceptualize all of those elements as you are trying to figure out what's going on in this family is going to be important. Sexuality. Okay, so what role does sexuality play in the family's relationship? And what are the sexual roles? Now, that could be kind of a heteronormative sexuality, but maybe there's something more than that. Maybe you're looking at a homosexual couple, or maybe you're looking at a family where a child has come out as not heterosexual, and how does their sexuality impact the rest of the family? What are the family's expectations about the individual member's sexuality? What are the family's rules about how sexuality is used, about what types of sexuality are okay? I think this again, so many elements in our society are shifting and hopefully continue to shift. And it's kind of the nature of a system is that we continue to evolve and progress and integrate. But if you have a family where they're very traditional or conservative roles and rules, and a child comes out, how is that going to impact the family? Why does the child, maybe 30 years ago, a child wouldn't have come out, but maybe there are elements in that exosystem that are pointing to it's now safer or it's now okay to not fit that heteronormative role. And so I'm going to now embrace, or a child is going to embrace that they're bisexual or homosexual. And then how does that smaller family system deal with it? Or maybe it's the friend of a child, and is that family going to create a boundary and say, because of that person's sexuality, you can no longer associate with them? And then how does that impact the system inside of the family and those relationships? Power, are some types of sexuality preferred, or some censured, both in society, in that broader system, but also within the family? So again, this is pieces to consider as you're conceptualizing what's going on in a family. Maybe it's reasons that family systems or family dynamics rather are shifting or are changing because something like this happens. Maybe a child comes out, or maybe even a parent comes out. That happens also. People will get married, have children, and then later on an adult will say, actually, I identify as bisexual or homosexual, and that can have a major impact in the family's system. Spirituality and religion. So maybe there are rules and roles and expectations that the religion as a whole kind of push into the family. What, or does my religion prescribe certain roles for me? And how well does my family, or does this family, fit the roles and expectations? Now, if we look, for example, at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is probably representative of a lot of our religion if we're at BYU, there are roles and rules, and some of those are quite clear and kind of codified. For example, in the Family Proclamation, or the proclamation to the world on the family. There we go. And sometimes there are people and families that feel like they don't fit into that. Maybe we have a single parent family, uh, single because of divorce or death or whatever it is. And they look at what is expected and the roles that they are given by this entity of which they are part, the system of the church, and they say, I don't fit that very well. And what does that mean about me? What does that mean about my family? So that's another element to be looking at as you're considering and conceptualizing families. Family rules that we get from religion. Now, these may be clear, like don't have sex before you get married. They may be a little bit less explicit. For example, someone who has a higher position in the church is therefore a more worthy and honorable person. Is that true? Is that explicit? No. But that is kind of a rule or a perception that may be part of the culture of the church. So recognizing both the implicit and explicit things that come from that religious institution, whatever a family is part of. And if they're part of a religion that you aren't familiar with, ask, find out maybe what some of the roles and rules and power dynamics that they get from that element that of their context is. Does our religion give some people power over things and people? So getting back to gender, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does talk a lot about kind of differentiating and specializing based on gender. And maybe the husband has the power in, to literally the priesthood power and can do things that the wife cannot do, like give a blessing, or now, as we're in COVID, maybe the husband has the power to bless a sacrament. The wife doesn't have that power, but maybe the wife is seen as having power in that nurturing sphere and over things of the house. So looking again at how does that power dynamic get impacted by religious beliefs and religious systems. Then economic. So economic, I'm talking particularly about socioeconomic status. This can include education, but also, for example, low income, middle income, high income families, how they perceive themselves, how society perceives them in terms of roles and expectations, who is in charge economically. And this can be back to gender. It may be maybe husband is in charge of bringing in money. Maybe wife is in charge of bringing in money. But who is in charge of the providing financially for the family? Who's in charge of spending the money? Who's in charge of balancing the accounts? Who's in charge of paying the bills? So all of those elements can be considered. How are social relationships used? So depending on economic status, sometimes social relationships, so the family's interactions with the larger systems are different. Perhaps in a high income family, social relationships are used as a way to network and to bring in more money or get more privileges or things like that. So those relationships, and we kind of think of good old boys maybe, but those relationships can be used to perpetuate that power system. Now we're kind of getting into power dynamics with economics. But the social relationships can be used to maybe get a son a job, or or to buy into an investment that most people don't know about. On the other hand, with a lower socioeconomic status, often social relationships are uh, used to be able to have basic necessities. So perhaps you've got a car that doesn't work very well, and you have to have friends who maybe can, at the drop of a hat, take you to work or help you get a sick child to the doctor. So sometimes social relationships in the lower socioeconomic status realm are necessary, and sometimes can even be like, it can be harder to have boundaries, because if I don't do something for you right now, maybe you won't be there for me later. And when it's hard to be supporting yourself, or economically you're just really disadvantaged, it can be harder to create the boundaries that are most healthy, because you are going to have to reach across those boundaries just for self-support at some point. How should money be spent? Again, we're looking at somebody who's kind of in a higher socioeconomic status. Money may be spent to perpetuate wealth, to make investments. If you're looking at somebody in the lower socioeconomic status, maybe money is spent kind of as it comes in, day to day. There's maybe not a lot of plan, because it, maybe it's hard to anticipate when money will come in again. And there's so many pressing needs that you take care of what's in front of you instead of being able to plan. Uh, in terms of power dynamics, a perception of locus of control, it's pretty typical. And again, I'm generalizing, and I recognize that I'm generalizing. So hopefully I'm not being offensive. And like I've said before, make sure you talk to the family about what their experience is. But it would be pretty standard for somebody in a middle or higher income status to have an internal locus of control, meaning I feel like I am in charge of myself and I can do it myself. I can see that what I do impacts the outcome, and what I do can take care of my needs, which is in some ways quite privileged. Um, we, though, as a society, tend to normalize that and say that internal locus of control is right. And when people don't have an internal locus of control, we say that they're acting like victims. Well, for somebody on a lower socioeconomic tier, and maybe there's some overlap with other um, of these cultural elements that we'll talk about, or that we have talked about, maybe there really are ways that control isn't theirs. Maybe there are social ways that perpetuate them being where they are. And maybe they feel like they have to work twice as hard because of their ethnicity or the color of their skin, and still aren't respected as somebody else is. And maybe they have a really hard time getting ahead, can't buy a house, or whatever it is. And so they recognize the system is much bigger than me, and I am part of a system. And so that locus of control may be a more external locus of control. And that can be debilitating and frustrating and painful for people. But as you are conceptualizing the family, recognizing that there is kind of an external locus of control, instead of judging it and just saying, well, you need to not be a victim, we can start to see, why is that locus of control external? And in what ways does having that recognition that an individual may not be have the power to direct their life fully, how does that perception by the person actually serve them? Why is it important that they see that there are systems that are bigger than them that really are impacting them? And one reason, I would ask you guys that question if we were doing this live, but one reason might be, if they were to continue to assume that everything was within their power, even as there are these societal systems that are set up that really, in many ways, keep them from having power, that would be so devastating. It would be very hard to continue to think of yourself as a worthy and good and worthwhile person, which, as I said in a lecture last week, all of us need to feel. It would be hard to see yourself as good and as capable and as worthy if no matter what you do, you can't move forward, or your forward progress is greatly curtailed, or you work and work and work but don't make as much progress as the person next to you. And so having that external locus of control may actually serve the person in helping them continue to see themselves as a valid, worthy, capable person. They're just part of a bigger system. Okay, hopefully you guys had some questions in there that we can bring up and talk about in the lab. Maybe you have some insights also. In digital dialogue, I'd love to hear about some of your experiences with some of these things. I don't have any reflection questions about that, particularly here, but they may be in the next lecture, just so you're thinking about it. Okay, interactions between cultural and contextual elements. Intersectionality is an idea that actually came up decades ago and was looking particularly at how the intersection between people's identities, so I think in the original case it was race and gender, but how those intersections further impact people. So I think in the original case that from which intersectionality, this idea of intersectionality was born, was a Black woman who was not able to get a job for which she was qualified. And when she brought up a lawsuit or something about it, well, the employer said, well, we hire Black people and we hire women, so we can't be discriminating against you. But the problem was the jobs for which Black people were hired were things like janitors, and it was all men. Only men, Black men were hired. And the jobs for which women were hired were secretarial, and no Black people were hired for that. So as a Black woman, she was in this intersection where she honestly couldn't get a job there. So that's where the idea of intersectionality came. The way I'm using it here is understanding more how things work together. So maybe you have, for example, in the Lee family, a white woman. So as from her gender, maybe she has fewer options in terms of jobs, in terms of education. Then you have an Asian man. And so he perhaps has experiences of oppression, of being looked at in society as less than. And so he perhaps has the opportunities for jobs and education as a man, but experiences some different forces than his wife as a woman does, and both may be experiencing things. And then you have their children, and granted their children are in a different generation, and so that chronosystem is changing through time. But as an Asian female, what is that going to mean for their oldest daughter, for example? And you'll get to read about what it means for her and how both parents may put some of their expectations on her. On the, I think it's the left of your screen, I'm assuming it's not mirrored. On the left of your screen, there's that kind of, it looks like a flower. Individual identity comes in the intersection of lots of different cultural and contextual elements. So maybe for example, you are a Black female, but able-bodied, and there are different challenges for you than a white male who is an amputee, has to be in a wheelchair, and is suffering from PTSD. So, there's all of these elements that work together, and as you are contextualizing things and conceptualizing families, recognizing how all of these things impact the family system, impact the individual, uh, impact the processes in the family will be important. Let's see others now. A lot of along the outside of that circle with the flower, a lot of these words may be uncomfortable: racism, discrimination, ableism, heterosexism, sexism, classism, ethnocentrism, transphobia, ageism, homophobia, xenophobia. So you may look at those and be like, I'm not any of those. Gross. And I'm not saying that you are, that you want to be. I don't know you. I'm not the expert in you. I recognize in myself that I see things in particular ways. So, ableism, for example, doesn't have to mean that I think somebody in a wheelchair is less worthy than me, but it might mean that I don't notice when the only accessibility option is stairs, and it doesn't bother me, and I don't do anything about it. And that may be ableism, because without even intending to, I am helping perpetuate the discrimination against someone who's in a wheelchair. I hope that makes sense. Um, Ethnocentrism, that may be I am in charge of vetting some new therapists. And as is kind of a human characteristic, and this is an important thing to realize as we think about why do some of these isms and phobias come up at all. But our brain is kind of programmed to accept and like what is most like us. And so maybe I'm thinking about all these applicants and I think, well, I'm good at my job and I do well at this company, so I better pick someone who is like me. And someone who is like me is going to be the best person for the job. And so maybe I overlook a male, or maybe I overlook someone of color, not because I think males are inherently incapable, and not because I think people of color are um, less worthy in any way. And maybe I really don't think that, but without even realizing that I'm doing it, I'm looking for someone like me, and that again perpetuates the system. So, as a therapist and as you're conceptualizing families, recognizing what is going on in my head, what do I see as like me? What do I see as preferable? What do I see, or what do I not see? Like maybe I do not see that stairs are the only access point, and that doesn't work for some people. Or maybe I don't see that the microphone, or I don't know, maybe in Sunday school they're not using a microphone and I can hear just fine, but perhaps the sister next to me is 75 years old and hears very poorly, and she's not able to get out of the meeting when I get out, and I do nothing about it, say nothing about it, think nothing about it. So as a therapist, as you're conceptualizing, recognize, what are you thinking about, what are you not thinking about, listen to the family's experience. Okay, some case studies to look at how these elements may interact. And I'll talk you through some of these. I'm not going to talk you through every aspect. We can talk about these more in the lab if you would like to. If you have questions or ideas or insights or thoughts about how some of these cultural and contextual elements may be impacting these families, I'd love to hear them. Like I've said, I would love for this to be a learning community, even as it's an on-demand class, because learning from each other is powerful. And as we share our experiences, we learn more. So take note. Hopefully you'll have things to share too. Okay, so here we have Rodriguez family. Mom there on the edge, and it looks like it would be 4 children, but we're just going to say in this hypothetical case example that the man standing next to mom is actually her new husband. And the 3 children are moms from a previous marriage. So you can see there under Rodriguez family, mom is 37, the new husband is 23, the children are 15, 9, and 4. Other considerations: mom is in the country illegally. She does have a job. She's working maybe um, for a family member or friend who is from the same country and is able to pay her in cash kind of under the table. The husband is not working. They have, low income. And other things to consider as maybe you're seeing this case: there's abuse between the mom and the new husband, verbal abuse and some physical abuse. Also, there's both verbal and physical abuse of the oldest child. Now, of course, in this picture, they're just smiling so sweetly. You would never know there's something wrong. The oldest daughter, and this would be kind of the presenting issue. Mom brings in oldest daughter to see you and basically is like, fix my daughter, because daughter is truant. She's not going to school. She's using drugs and she's self-harming. And daughter also maybe reports being depressed and suicidal. So, as we conceptualize what's going on with this family, what are some of the elements? What are some of the elements that we're going to ask about? Recognizing, as we said last week in systems theory, we don't focus on one individual and see that individual as the problem. We look at the whole system and see, how is this system, both the family system and the broader social system, impacting what's going on and perpetuating this problem or creating this problem. So maybe we talk to the mom and the daughter, find out there is a lot of conflict. Daughter is 15, it's a pretty typical age and now we're looking at family development. It's a pretty typical age for there to be conflict, but there's greatly increased conflict because mom mom's choice to get married to this new guy was not one that the daughter was happy with. She feels like the new guy doesn't pull his weight and is domineering, and the daughter doesn't like seeing the new guy beat up on her mom, and she also doesn't like how the new guy bosses the kids around. She does not feel like she needs a boss who is not even 10 years older than she is. And maybe other elements of this, in terms of social system, the daughter does speak English, grew up in the States, but the people that she associates with are mostly other kids who are like her. And one of her friends' parents, because there are very few economic options or job options, maybe deals drugs. And so she's doing drugs not because she is looking to be trouble or get into trouble, but because she's kind of self-medicating this difficult family life. And she has a bunch of friends who say, this is what we're doing. We've got all these free drugs. Why won't you come and join us? And so there's some social pressures there too. So conceptualizing what's going on in this family, we need to look at maybe gender roles also. Why is mom working and not the new husband? What's going into his not working? Are there things we need to consider there? We're in Utah Valley. How does religion impact things? Turns out the new husband maybe is LDS, and Mom has joined the LDS church so that they can be married, but doesn't really want to attend. Um, Maybe mom has married this younger guy because she is illegal and needs papers, and this is a way for her to become legal and to have different options for her family. So you start to see there's so many elements, and as we think about conceptualizing the family, a big reason that we need to conceptualize is so that we know how to act, how to move forward, how to help there be changes. So, in this instance, we would probably need to involve more than just a family therapist. There are some social work issues here. With there being abuse of the 15-year-old, this would be a case where DCFS would need to be called. Uh, if there's continued domestic violence, maybe the police need to be involved also. Probably the police need to be involved. Um, and yet, what is that going to do? If DCFS comes in and says, yes, there is abuse going on and recognizes that mom is illegal, what happens to the family if mom is deported? So there's all these elements. And a case like this can be really challenging to know how to move forward. But again, conceptualizing what's going on in the family and then being able to highlight the processes and the patterns that you are seeing. You bring in not just daughter. Maybe mom comes in and says, here's my daughter, fix her. But you say, okay, mom, I need to have you in here too. I need to see how you interact. Okay, now I need to have the other kids and I need to have the new husband in. Maybe I need to bring in ex-husband also. And then we start to see the patterns in the family. We start to hear more about how they're being impacted by the larger systems. And then we get to talk about and move forward with, okay, what are the goals? If the goals are for daughter to be in school and stop using drugs and not be suicidal and self-harming, mom, here are some ways that this whole system of which you are a part is contributing to that. And so there you go. There's kind of an example of that. Okay, next we've got Smith family. So this is a single parent family. Dad died of cancer a few years ago. By the way, these families are not real families, obviously. um, they're case conceptualizations. Sometimes I pull in elements from families that I've really seen that I feel like illustrate a point well. But because of confidentiality issues, can't use real families. So dad died of cancer a few years ago. Kids are 13, 11, and 7. Oh, I wrote down he died of cancer last year. Mom runs a successful Etsy shop. She has come in, or this family has come in because of parenting issues. The oldest, the 13-year-old, is described as defiant. Mom is struggling with depression. So far, the other kids seem to be okay. So as we're looking at, the relationship between mom and the oldest son and mom's depression, again, we're going to be conceptualizing what's going on here. So in terms of gender, was mom expecting, or does mom feel prepared to take on not only the role of nurturer, but also breadwinner? If she wasn't doing that before, how does this impact things? In terms of socioeconomic status, if husband died of cancer, is there less income now? Was there insurance? Do they, are they going to be okay? Could they not need an income right now? We don't know. Religiously, what kind of Um, Resources does the family have? What kind of community does the family have? Do they feel, if they are in Utah, say, and are not members of the church, how is that going to impact them? If they are, how is that going to impact them? How connected do they feel to their closer family? Um, and the 13-year-old, what's going on for him in school? What's going on for him with friends? There's obviously going to be some grief. Has the family been able to process that grief? What were the expectations of the son before his dad died? What are the roles and expectations of the son now that his dad has died? Um, and for him being a boy, how does that impact things? Uh, as a possibility, maybe he's identifying as homosexual also, as gay, um, and doesn't feel like he can talk to his mom about it, and is afraid that she will reject him because he's already seeing her be emotionally vulnerable, and he's afraid that his coming out as gay will just wreck her, but it's also currently wrecking him. So, all of these issues, being able to kind of talk to the family. And again, I'll say it again, in family therapy, it's really great, and in marriage therapy, to bring in as much of the system as you can, because you get so many different perspectives. And then informing yourself about the culture and the context. Um, so with this family, bringing them in, maybe the younger son and daughter have some insights about what's going on. Maybe they can tell you how they see things. Maybe you do some conceptualization by having the family show or talk about their relationships with each other, what they can share and what they can't share. Maybe they talk about how things feel economically. Maybe they talk about their gender roles. Maybe they talk about religion and how that's an impact. So you can assess for all of these different things. Okay, the Liu family. Um, Father was in tech and recently lost his job because of COVID. Mom has a marketing degree but hasn't been working. She's been staying home with the kids. They immigrated from Hong Kong. The oldest child, who's 11, is on the autism spectrum, which with coronavirus, the family is struggling with, because some of the resources that were available pre-coronavirus are less available now, less in-person school time. The masking is maybe quite difficult for this child because of sensory issues. So things are kind of come to a head. Middle child is 5, the youngest is 3. They come in, maybe mom and dad come in with communication issues. That's so common, they'll just say, we're having a hard time communicating. We don't know how to deal with conflict. Or maybe there's some depression also. And so again, we'll assess gender roles. Perhaps in this Asian family, gender roles are quite important and they're more traditional. And husband not having a job, uh, that inherently makes him feel somehow less worthy, less capable, and that leads to depression. It also means that because he's feeling poorly about himself, gets more easily triggered. Perhaps his wife says something about, I don't know where the money is going to come from. And that means to him, what he hears is, you're not a good provider. And so he gets upset and maybe takes it out on the kids or snaps back at his wife. So again, the whole system, how does the gender role, how do the gender roles and expectations play a part in what's going on? Is it possible for mom to take a job right now? if it was possible for her to take a job, would that be the best thing for the family? How would dad feel about taking on the caretaking role? Uh, Given his sense of his gender roles, what would that be like for him? How would he deal with having an autistic child? One of the things as a mom, if you have a child with special needs, you learn how to deal with that and you learn the resources. And if dad has been removed from the home and has not had that practice, it would be pretty normal for it to be a steep learning curve and really difficult for him. So we've got elements of gender, we've got elements of ethnicity and culture, we've got some able or disability here. Maybe the family is not or not members of the church and live in Utah Valley, or maybe they are members of the church and live outside of Utah. And so maybe that's one of the resources they have is they can draw on some bishop help, or they can talk to other ward members that they feel supported by. Maybe they're part of a community where there's lots of other Asians, and so they have that community support. Or maybe they're part of a community where there are very, very few other Asians, and so they feel really isolated and not understood. So that again are things to ask about, to consider. Um, Being able to point out what's going on between the husband and wife, being able to help them express and see the challenges that they are facing in the context of gender and ethnicity um, and religion and community and maybe ability, can help them normalize and kind of de-escalate. It can also help you as you're conceptualizing the family to get a sense of, like I've said, how to move forward. So if this is a family, an Asian family in a community where there are many Asian families, finding out how they could perhaps draw on that strength would be good. If they're an Asian family where there are very few other Asian families, being able to talk about how that's difficult and find other ways for them to access resources and social systems and networks could be helpful. Maybe there's family close by, or maybe there are family resources that are further away but still accessible. So there you go. Okay, Jones family. We've got two dads here, 136 and 128, 9-month-old son who is African American descent. They do live close to family. They're both employed full-time at jobs that they like, but they're experiencing conflict in their marriage. The son is 9 months old, and they maybe just adopted him about 8 or 9 months ago. So there was kind of this honeymoon period of, oh, we have a baby finally. And then it starts to get harder, and babies tend not to sleep at night and need a lot of physical care. And um, it's hard to juggle when two people are, both working. Maybe there's a good daycare situation that falls through when coronavirus hits, um, or maybe one person's job becomes, or maybe both of their jobs become things they can do at home. So they say, well, we don't need the childcare anymore. But turns out you can't do a job and take care of a 9-month-old at the same time. And so they start to get upset with each other, both feeling like they need the other person's support and neither feeling like they're doing as well as they want to be doing in their jobs and as dads. And so there begins to be conflict as they start to not know how to approach this difficulty. And what does that mean? And then, we have the sexuality issue. There's a principle called minority stress, where if you're in a minority, and particularly if that minority is seen as less than in some way, it becomes harder to overcome that stereotype of less than, simply because of the level of stress that stereotype causes. So maybe these men feel like there is this kind of societal expectation that their marriage will fail and that they won't be good parents. And so, as they are starting to feel this conflict between them, the societal expectations and the societal pressures that come because of their sexuality start to create more stress. And then that just perpetuates the problem. And so, uh, being able to assess what's going on, not only between these men, but also what are their perceptions of how they are seen in society, what are their perceptions of their likelihood of success or failure, and what does it mean to them that they're having this conflict. Does it mean that they really are a failure, um, or can we reframe that and talk about how normal it is to have stress like this in the midst of a pandemic with a young child, two working parents? So there's kind of an idea of conceptualizing. Let's see here. So there's so much to understanding context and culture. There's a lot of readings this week, and I don't want you to get overwhelmed by readings. If your other classes are light and you really want to read all of those things, that's great. Do it. There's so much out there, and being able to recognize what's happening for other people, and at all levels, both internally and externally, and all the levels of the system, can be so just invaluable as you're conceptualizing what's going on in families. Like I said, these contexts and cultural things are kind of the umbrella. So we won't talk about them a lot as part of other models, but they will always exist, just like the systems theory founds and kind of grounds all those other models. So next time in our next lecture, we'll be talking about self of the therapist, and we'll be pulling in some of these issues as we talk about self of the therapist. Self of the therapist is about understanding you and being the best tool you can be for conceptualizing, perceiving what's going on in the family, and acting. So that's all for now, and I'll look forward to seeing you for the next lecture.